Welcome to Truthology, a journey into the very essence of truth. In this series, we'll explore the fundamental mysteries of life's origin and meaning. How did we get here? Where did we come from? What brought us into existence? What is our relationship to reality as a whole? Sometimes I wonder why anyone talks about anything else. Because this is the most interesting topic in the world. If you're listening to this and you think that knowing the answers to these questions with certainty, to really have proof, is impossible, all I can say is stay tuned. I made this series just for you, so you can see, know, and judge the evidence for yourself. Welcome to Truthology.
Hello, and welcome to Truthology. I'm your host, Jeffrey Libby. Well, I hope you guys are as excited as I am, because today we're going to dive into the actual historical evidence of Jesus' resurrection. Many people have directly said to me that in their view, all religions in the end come down to just a matter of personal preference or opinion. They use phrases like, "Oh, it's great that you're living your truth," or "I'm so glad that you found something that works for you," and things of that nature. While I appreciate their kind sentiments, they miss the point entirely. Christianity is not about feelings or preferences, but rather it's based on verifiable historical facts, which we're about to review. And as we review these facts, remember that if they are true, which I assure you that you will see they are, the implications are beyond enormous. It's not just about this lifetime. It's about what's going to happen to you after you die and where you'll spend eternity. And that's real. And that's also what they call the good news. Because we're going to see both how you can know what happens after you die, and also how you could control, or in other words, what and who determines where you'll end up after you die. Christianity, you see, doesn't have some secret hidden teachings. Christianity isn't like the Freemasons or Scientology, where there's some secret rites or levels that need to be achieved before you can learn the teachings. Instead, Christianity is based on actual historical facts, the most important of which is the resurrection of Jesus. So, in order to get to the bottom of whether or not Jesus' resurrection really happened, we'll use something called the minimal facts argument. The minimal facts approach was originally popularized by one of my heroes, Dr. Gary Habermas, one of the world's leading experts on the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Professor Habermas holds a doctorate of philosophy from Michigan State University in history and philosophy of religion, Also, he's the chairman of the Department of Philosophy at Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia, and he is the author, co-author, or editor of over 40 books. Additionally, since 1975, Dr. Habermas has been translating and cataloging scholarly articles about ancient biblical history from thousands of scholars in not only English, but in French and German as well. The idea of the minimal facts argument is that we will only use those facts which are so strongly attested historically that they are agreed upon nearly universally by all scholars who study these subjects. This unanimous consensus, as mentioned previously, is based on Dr. Habermas's meticulous cataloging of all scholarly articles related to these facts by both Christian and non-Christian scholars alike in English, French, and German since the mid-1970s. So, to be clear, we are going to examine 5 historical facts, all of which are accepted virtually unanimously by all scholars of ancient history worldwide. As we go over each of these facts, we'll look at the overwhelming historical evidence for each one so you can see for yourself why each is accepted as an indisputable historical fact. Then, once we have all 5 facts on the table, we'll analyze them as a group. We'll ask if anything other than a literal, historical, and physical resurrection of Jesus could possibly account for all of the facts that we will have gathered. We will find that the answer is no. No other explanation can account for the evidence except that the physical resurrection of Jesus is literally and historically true. Now, I know my audience, and I'm sure you're already thinking, well, there must be some other explanation. You're saying to yourself, Jeff keeps saying agreed by virtually all historical scholars. What about that other 1%? There must be some other opposing viewpoints that skeptics present, you're thinking. And indeed there are. Therefore, I've always thought of it as my job on this journey to save you time by doing the research for you and by presenting both sides of the argument to you in a systematic and unbiased way. As such, after we go over the positive case for the resurrection, based on the historical facts, we'll also go through all the objections and each one of the alternate theories proposed by those who deny the resurrection so that we can see if those theories hold water, which, spoiler alert, they don't. In part 4 of this series, the section following these videos on the historicity of the resurrection, we're going to talk a lot more about the Bible. For now, we should just touch upon it briefly in regards to how we are going to use the Bible in this section. In this part of our inquiry, when we're solely focused on analyzing the historicity of Jesus' resurrection, we're only going to use those passages from the Bible that are accepted by virtually all non-Christian scholars as historical. What that means is that, of course, on the one hand, we cannot use the Bible as the sole source for proving the events laid out in the Bible. At the same time, however, we would also be remiss to declare the entire New Testament off limits. Not even the most extreme non-Christian scholar would do that. That would be like saying, for example, you wanted to research the historical events of the American Civil War, but you reject all sources or testimony from anyone involved in the Civil War in any way. Again, we're going to talk about the question of the Bible and its divine inspiration specifically and in depth in the next section. For now, however, suffice it to say that the New Testament is made up of a number of different books, which were written by a variety of authors at different times and in different places. These books did not come together into one book or become canonized until later. Therefore, for the purposes of this section, we do not need to look at the Bible as inerrant, divinely inspired, or to make any other blanket conclusions about it as a whole, one way or another. We'll save those questions for the next section. Instead, in this section, what we're going to do, in keeping with the minimal facts approach, is to first and foremost cite a multiplicity of non-Christian sources. Then, when it comes to what is known today as the New Testament, we'll only use those specific individual passages which even the most skeptical non-Christian scholars universally accept as historical. I hope that's clear. And we'll go into the details on those particular passages as we move forward and we encounter each example. But in general, the Apostle Paul is known as the darling of the critics. Critical scholars overwhelmingly accept 7 Pauline epistles or letters as historical and written by Paul himself. Specifically, these are Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. Well, why, you're probably wondering, do all the critics, even and especially non-Christian ones, love the Apostle Paul so much? What's so special about him? Well, Paul is known as the darling of the critics because first off, he started as a highly educated Jew. Basically, he was the ancient equivalent of a PhD in Old Testament studies under the famous teacher Gamaliel. Paul, whose story we'll go into in more detail later, is beloved by the critics because he was a scholar, and he spent his early life persecuting Christians who he viewed as heretical. Therefore, critics rightly perceive Paul as someone who would never purposefully lie. Why wouldn't he lie? Because he was literally out there hunting Christians before his conversions. Skeptical scholars love Paul because he's a scholar, an extremely thoughtful and logical writer, and he was an enemy of the Christians who therefore would have no motive to intentionally lie. Finally, Paul also knew the apostles personally, so his testimony is of a first-hand, eyewitness nature. For a quick quote on this, we'll turn to non-Christian textual critic Bart Ehrman, who said, and I quote, "Paul actually knew at least a couple of Jesus' early disciples, Peter and John, and even more impressive, his brother James, end quote. So, in summary, as we're reviewing the 5 historical facts concerning the resurrection of Jesus, we're not going to arbitrarily and completely exclude all sources that are part of what is today called the Bible. Instead, we are only going to use those specific and individual passages from what is now known as the New Testament, which are universally accepted by virtually all non-Christian scholars as factual and historical. Finally, of course, we're also going to look at a myriad of additional pieces of evidence from non-Christian sources as well. So, let's get started with our review of the 5 historical facts, which are virtually universally accepted by all scholars of ancient history, and let's see for ourselves the reasons and evidence behind their acceptance. Then, once we've collected all the facts related to the case, we'll analyze them as a whole. We'll see if there is any plausible explanation for this group of facts other than the literal and historical resurrection of Jesus. Remember, as we're going through these facts, that each one does not prove or disprove the resurrection on its own. We want to go about this case like a detective, first going to the crime scene and gathering the evidence, and then, once we have all of our evidence in hand, we'll take it back to our proverbial lab and analyze all the pieces of the case together as a whole to see if they disprove or prove the resurrection. So, with that said, let's get right to it, shall we? Fact number 1 is the crucifixion. In an effort to put the cookies on the bottom shelf, so to speak, our first fact is that Jesus not only really physically existed in history, but also that he died by crucifixion. Now, obviously, the fact that Jesus was really killed by crucifixion does not prove that he was really resurrected. No one is saying that. However, if Jesus was just a fictional character who never actually was killed, then he also wasn't resurrected. Therefore, in order to prove the resurrection, to start from the very top, or the most basic fundamentals, we're going to look at if Jesus was really a historical figure who died by crucifixion, or if he was just a made-up fictional character. Once that fact is established, then we'll move on to the second historical fact. Some of you probably think this first historical fact is so obvious we don't even need to include it. Well, let me tell you, many people, both in the past and still today, claim that Jesus never existed, that he never was crucified, or that he didn't die on the cross. Let's start by quoting, in response to that, the liberal historical scholar Marcus Borg, who says, and I quote, "Some judgments are so probable as to be certain. For example, Jesus really existed and he really was crucified," end quote. So let's look at some of the actual sources now and see for ourselves why scholars virtually universally accept that Jesus was indeed a real historical figure who died by crucifixion. First off, let's talk about the Gospels. Without using the Bible to prove the Bible, it's important to note that no matter how skeptical a critic may be about the Gospels, It is well accepted that Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts, and John were all written during the 1st century. These are some of the earliest reports we have of the life and death of Jesus, all within 70 years max of his death. And all of those 4 independent sources record that Jesus was executed by crucifixion. In addition to the early Christian and New Testament sources, there are also many non-Christian ancient sources which report Jesus' life and death by crucifixion as well. So let's look at some of those now. First, Tacitus, who lived from 56 to 120 AD, is considered by modern scholars to be one of the greatest Roman historians. Tacitus attests to the existence of Jesus, his execution by Pontius Pilate, and the early Christians' presence in Rome. Specifically, Tacitus reports, and I quote, "Nero fastened the guilt of the burning of Rome and inflicted the most exquisite of tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, which means Christ in Greece, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate." End quote. So as you just heard for yourself, Tacitus, the Roman historian, is directly citing Jesus' execution. Historians agree it's firmly established that Tacitus provides a non-Christian confirmation of the crucifixion of Jesus. In addition to Roman sources like Tacitus, we also have a famous reference from Lucian of Samosata, the Greek writer who wrote, and I quote, "The Christians, you know, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. It was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws." End quote. So you can see here, Lucian of Samosata, in an early and independent Greek historian who clearly verifies Jesus' crucifixion as well. In addition to these Roman and Greek sources, yet another early non-Christian reference to the crucifixion of Jesus comes from Mara bar Serapion, a Stoic philosopher from the Roman province of Syria. In a letter, which is at the British Museum to this day, Bar Serapion writes, and I quote, "Or what advantage came to the Jews by the murder of their wise king, seeing that from the very time their kingdom was driven away from them." End quote. On top of the Greek, Roman, and Syrian sources, we also have a number of Jewish sources. For example, Josephus, the famous ancient Jewish historian, writes, and I quote, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him. For he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribes of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct to this day." End quote. In addition to Josephus, another Jewish source is called the Talmud. The Jewish Talmud is the earliest collection of Jewish law and history. It reports that, and I quote, "On the eve of Passover, Yeshu was hanged," end quote. And note that Yeshu is Hebrew for Jesus, and being hanged or hung on a tree was a description of crucifixion in antiquity. So here we have reviewed the following 9 independent sources. First, the 4 New Testament gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Second, Tacitus of Rome. Third, Lucian of Greece. Fourth, Mara bar Serapion of Syria. 5, Josephus, the Jewish historian. And 6, the Jewish Talmud. In summary, Bart Ehrman, a non-Christian critical scholar, says, and I quote, "The crucifixion of Jesus by the Romans is one of the most secure facts we have about his life," end quote. And in fact, even outdoing our 9 sources, Ehrman cites in his books 15 independent sources for the crucifixion. Clearly, you can see now why Jesus' death by crucifixion is a historical fact supported by all critical scholars because of the overwhelming preponderance of hard evidence that is still in existence to this day. Even the highly critical scholar John Dominic Crossan sums it up when he writes, and I quote, "that he, Jesus, was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be," end quote. So now we have our first fact, that Jesus was a real historical figure who was killed by crucifixion. Now, of course, the fact that Jesus died by crucifixion does not prove that he was resurrected. No one is saying that. At this point, we're just gathering the evidence one piece at a time and building the case from the ground up. So let's now put fact 1 away on our proverbial evidence shelf and move on to the next fact. Then, once we've collected all of our facts, we'll analyze them as a group to see if they prove the resurrection or not. So fact number 2 is that Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, which was later found to be empty. John A.T. Robinson writes that, "And Jesus' burial is," and I quote, "one of the earliest and best attested facts about Jesus," end quote. Fact number 2, that Jesus was buried in a tomb that was later found empty, is pretty much self-explanatory. Remember, Jesus was publicly crucified in Jerusalem, where his empty tomb was first proclaimed. Clearly then, it would have been impossible for Christianity to get off the ground in Jerusalem if the body was indeed still in the tomb. Why is that? Well, just think about it for a minute. the Jewish and Roman enemies of Christianity would only have had to publicly display Jesus' body, or even simply point to the closed tomb, and the Christian movement would have been instantly and forever crushed. On the other hand, if the tomb was not in fact empty, there is no way to explain the early and explosive rise of Christianity following Jesus' execution. As prominent New Testament scholar N.T. Wright sums it up, and I quote, "As a historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him," end quote. In addition to the fact that the enemies of Jesus could not produce the body and thereby quell the movement, we also have many early Christian sources which unanimously corroborate the empty tomb. For example, number 1, the Gospel of Mark; number 2, the Gospel of John; number 3, the pre-Markan source, which is that most scholars believe that Mark used a pre-Markan passion narrative source, which was composed before 37 AD, less than 7 years after the cross. Number 4, we have the Pauline Creed, found in Acts 13. And in addition to these 4 gospel sources, let's review a few other early sources for the empty tomb, shall we? First, we have the Jews, as quoted in Matthew 28:12 and 13, which says, and I quote, "When they were assembled with the elders and had taken counsel, they gave large money unto the soldiers, saying, Say ye, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we slept," end quote. That's a good example, by the way, of the enemy attestation we talked about earlier. Do you understand? You see, if the tomb was not in fact empty, then clearly the Jews would not have had to make up such a ridiculous story as to say that the body was stolen while the guards were sleeping. I mean, think about it for a minute. They're saying that the guards didn't catch the thieves because the guards were asleep. Yet at the same time, they're claiming that while the guards were sleeping, they saw that it was the disciples who stole the body. Of course, that's a ridiculous and nonsensical excuse, but the very ridiculousness of it is what so strongly attests to its historicity. Why is that, you ask? Well, because if the tomb was not in fact found empty, then a hasty and illogical excuse wouldn't have been needed or created in the first place. Anyways, next we have Justin Martyr, who was a Christian philosopher who lived in the early 100s AD and wrote, and I quote, "The resurrection of Christ did not convert the Jews, but through the whole world they have sent men to accuse Christ. And though all the men of your nation knew the incidents in the life of Jonah, and though Christ said among you that he would give the sign of Jonah, exhorting you to repent of your wicked deeds, at least after he rose again from the dead, and to mourn before God as did the Ninevites, in order that your nation and city might not be taken and destroyed, as they have been destroyed. Yet you not only have not repented after you learned that he rose from the dead, but as I said before, You have sent chosen and ordained men throughout all the world to proclaim that a godless and lawless heresy had sprung from one Jesus, a Galilean deceiver, whom we crucified. But his disciples stole him by night from the tomb where he was laid when unfastened from the cross, and now deceive men by asserting that he has risen from the dead and ascended to heaven. Moreover, you accuse him of having taught those godless, lawless, and unholy doctrines which you mention to the condemnation of those who confess him to be Christ and a teacher from the Son of God. Besides this, even when your city is captured and your land ravaged, you do not repent, but dare to utter imprecations on him and all who believe in him. Yet we do not hate you or those who, by your means, have conceived such prejudices against us. But we pray that even now all of you may repent and obtain mercy from God, the compassionate and long-suffering Father of all." End quote. Wow. So there you can see yet another early and independent source attesting to the fact that the tomb was empty and the Christians were being accused of stealing the body. Next up, we have Tertullian. Tertullian was a Tunisian author born in AD 160 who writes in his De Spectaculis 30, and I quote, "This I shall say, this is that carpenter's or hireling's son, that Sabbath breaker, that Samaritan and devil possessed. This is he who you purchased from Judas. This is he whom you struck with reed and fist, whom you contemptuously spat upon, to whom you gave gall and vinegar to drink. This is he whom his disciples secretly stole away, that it might be said, he has risen again, or the gardener abstracted, that his lettuces might come to no harm from the crowds of visitants." End quote. These historical records all clearly attest to the fact of the missing corpse. If the tomb was not indeed empty, Jesus' corpse would simply have been produced, and the entire Christian movement would have been instantly and forever crushed. Furthermore, if the tomb was not really empty, there would also obviously have been no need to accuse the disciples of stealing the body. This is a classic example of enemy attestation, which shows the historicity of an event because even the enemies do not deny it. On top of all of this, the criterion of embarrassment also comes into play in assessing the historicity of the empty tomb. The criterion of embarrassment, as I'm sure you remember from the previous episode, is the simple principle that if something is embarrassing to someone, they are very unlikely to have made it up, because people obviously don't like to embarrass themselves. Well, the fact that the tomb was discovered empty by Jesus' female followers is reported unanimously in all four Gospels. This is notable because the fact that the empty tomb was discovered by Jesus' female followers is a classic example of the criterion of embarrassment. And therefore, it strongly attests to the true historicity of the event. Let me explain. Fortunately, it's not the case today, but back in those times, in both Roman and Jewish cultures, the testimony of women was regarded as practically worthless. Okay, don't take my word for it. Let's look at just a couple of quotes which illustrate this point. The first is from Josephus, the aforementioned Jewish historian, who says, and I quote, "But let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of the levity and boldness of their sex," end quote. Second, the Jewish Talmud says, and I quote, "Although in certain cases a woman's testimony is accepted, for example, to testify to the death of someone's husband, in the majority of cases, her testimony is not valid, period," end quote. So given the extremely low regard for the testimony of women in the first century, it's plainly obvious that if the Christians were to make up the account of the empty tomb, they would not have cast women as their first and key witnesses. So, in conclusion, because we have hard evidence that the enemies of the Christians were admitting the tomb was empty, they could not produce the body, and the key Christian witnesses were women, the vast and overwhelming majority of historical scholars accept the fact that the tomb was indeed, literally, historically, and physically found empty. This conclusion is summarized by Oxford University historian William Wand, who writes, and I quote, "All the strictly historical evidence we have is in favor of the empty tomb, and those scholars who reject it ought to recognize that they do so on some other ground than that of scientific history," end quote. I don't know how you could explain it more clearly than that, but we'll try with finally eminent New Testament historian N.T. Wright, who concludes his massive book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, which is probably the single most comprehensive study of the resurrection ever produced, by saying that the fact that the tomb was empty has, and I quote, "a historical probability so high as to be virtually certain, same as the death of Augustus in AD 14 or the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, end quote. So we already had our first fact that Jesus was crucified on our evidence shelf. Now we can place our second fact that Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, from which he was later found missing, also on our evidence shelf. Later, once we have all 5 of our facts, we'll come back to our evidence shelf and analyze them all as a group. With those 2 facts in place, we're almost out of time. And you know, I started this episode talking about some things people say to me about this show. And some people say, "Oh, I love your studio, it's so cool." Other people say, "Oh, you should get rid of that studio and just walk around with a selfie stick in the woods." Or some people tell me they love the way I dress. Others tell me how I should be more casual to connect with younger people. Some people tell me no one will ever watch this kind of content. Other people tell me it'll surely go viral. Well, let me tell you, I don't care about any of those things. They are literally the farthest thing from what this series is actually about. It's not about sounding smart, looking good, winning an argument. It's about actually knowing if Jesus really was who he claimed to be. If he wasn't, he was the biggest fraud in all of history. But if he was who he claimed to be, then your eternal destiny rests on whether or not you accept the bail that he paid for you personally on the cross. I was for a long time an atheist myself, so you can rest assured I'm not going to say that you're a fool if you don't already know that the resurrection really happened. What I can say, though, is that so much is riding on it if it did happen, and there's such a huge amount of hard historical evidence that it did, that it would be foolish, or perhaps I should say one would be remiss to simply ignore that entire body of evidence and not even consider it. Well, beloved viewers, I know you guys want to know the evidence, so I hope you'll share it with your friends and loved ones and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next episode, where we'll move on to fact number 3 of our 5 historical facts related to the resurrection of Jesus. I'll see you there. Thanks so much for joining me on this episode of Truthology. Please click like to show me that you enjoyed this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any future episodes. Also, please be sure to check out the description below this video to learn how you can get in touch with me, ask me about any subjects you'd like me to cover, join my mailing list, see me at live events, and get involved with the entire Truthology community. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Until then, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time on Truthology.